Happy Saturday, everyone! We are going to finish up our second book together, Esther 9, chapter 9, and Esther chapter 10. So today, how it's going to go, it's going to go a little bit differently today. I'm not going to put in any scripture cross-references for 9 and 10 because there's a lot of them. But today, I have an article from thetorah.com about Purim that I would like to share. And we are going to read out of the NIV, the Amplified Version for chapter 9 and chapter 10. And of course, we are going to start with our Bible, the Bible Hub chapter summaries for both chapters. And then, of course, I'm going to read the cultural backgrounds notes here, bullet points here. Okay, so let me go ahead and put these resources in here first. So that way we have them. Let's see here. And I'm thinking about the next book would probably be let's go into the New Testament this next round. Let me see here. I'm going to put these resources in here so that way you have them. Copy. The YouTube playlist for Esther is updated, and then I'll also update today's live on there as well to complete the book of Esther playlist. So there's 9 amplified. Copy. I'll even put the article in there that I'll read from. And then let's do chapter 10. Almost there, guys. I'm just getting the chapter 10 in there. Make sure you guys have those verses. Chapter 10. I have to do it this way. There we go. And NIV version, chapter 10. All right. So I have all the resources that we're going to read today, including the chapters for both Amplified and NIV for 9 and 10, plus the article from thetorah.com and both chapter summaries. All right. So let's go ahead and read chapter 9 summary. Okay. So we are at the point where it's the Feast of Purim. Okay. So triumph and thanksgiving, Esther's victory, and the establishment of Purim. The story of Esther 9 is a stirring reminder of how God can turn situations of severe adversity into astounding victory. It is a testament to the power of faith, unity, and courageous leadership, signifying that even in the face of enormous difficulties, hope and deliverance are possible. It is an invitation to commemorate God's deliverance and celebrate life with joy, generosity, and gratitude. In verses 1 through 10, the Jews triumph over their enemies. On the day previously appointed for their annihilation, the Jews instead defend themselves, killing their enemies throughout the provinces of Persia. In the city of Susa, they kill 500 men along with 10 sons of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. In verses 11 to 15 is Esther's petition and the second day of slaughter. King Xerxes tells Queen Esther about the killings in Susa and his provinces. She requests that the Jews in Susa be granted another day to destroy their enemies, and that Haman's 10 sons be hanged. The king grants her petition, leading to the death of 300 more men in Susa. In verses 16 to 19 of chapter 9 of Esther, it's the celebrating the victory. The Jews in the provinces rest and celebrate their victory on the 14th day of Adar, and feasting and joy. Meanwhile, those in Susa rest on the 15th day, following 2 days of killing their enemies, and they also make it a day of feasting and joy. In verses 20 to 32 is the establishment of the festival of Purim. Mordecai records these events and sends letters to all the Jews in King Xerxes' provinces, declaring the 14th and 15th days of Adar as the time to celebrate Purim. The Jews commit themselves and their descendants to the observance of these days as a time of feasting, joy, sending gifts to each other, and giving to the poor. Esther chapter 9 from the Berean Standard Bible portrays a turning point in Jewish history where potential disaster turns into a joyous victory. It narrates the triumph of the Jews over their enemies on the day intended for their extermination, and the subsequent establishment of the festival of Purim as a day of celebration and thanksgiving. The themes in chapter 9 are triumph over adversity, the establishment of tradition, deliverance and justice, celebration and joy, unity among the Jewish community. And the topics are the Jewish victory over their enemies, the establishment of the festival of Purim, mourning turned into celebration, the power of unity and faith, Esther's continued leadership. And the people in Esther chapter 9 is Queen Esther, Mordecai, King Xerxes, Haman, which is mentioned, Jews in Susa and provinces of Persia. And the locations are the city of Susa and provinces of Persia. So let's go ahead and read Esther chapter 10 summary as well. And this is the tribute to Xerxes and Mordecai. It's the majestic rule of Mordecai. Esther 10 reminds us that individuals, regardless of their origin, can rise to prominence and make a difference in the lives of their people. Mordecai's story is one of humble beginnings, leading to an influential position from which he was able to bring about prosperity and peace for his people. In verse 1, it's a tribute to King Xerxes. The chapter opens by acknowledging King Xerxes' imposing authority, stating that he imposed tribute throughout his empire, reaching as far as the distant coastlands. This shows the vastness and strength of King Xerxes' rule. In verses 2 to 3, it's the prominence of Mordecai. The narrative then shifts to Mordecai, whom King Xerxes has made his second command. Mordecai is recognized for his great achievements and his high rank, next only to King Xerxes in the kingdom. These verses also mention the documentation of Mordecai's acts of power and the details of his high honor in the royal chronicles of Media and Persia. Mordecai's rule brought great prosperity to the Jews, earning him the admiration of his people. Esther chapter 10, although brief, is a concluding chapter that highlights the authority and influence of Mordecai, the cousin of Queen Esther. In this chapter, Mordecai, once an ordinary Jew, is elevated to a position of great honor and respect in King Xerxes' empire. The themes of the last chapter of the book of Esther, which is chapter 10, is authority and leadership, fidelity to one's people, wisdom and influence, prosperity and peace. The topics are Mordecai's high rank, influence and power, prosperity under leadership, record keeping, and history. People are King Xerxes or Ahasuerus, also known as Ahasuerus, Mordecai the Jew, and the location is Persia and King Xerxes' empire. All right, so let's go ahead and get to reading here. So I'm going to start in chapter 9, and it is going to be in the NIV version. Okay? So, on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the edict commanded by the king was to be carried out. On this day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them. But now the tables were turned, and the Jews got the upper hand over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those determined to destroy them. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai was prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The Jews struck down all their enemies. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed, forgive me, Lord. You guys forgive me for the mispronunciation of these names. Okay. It's Parshandatha, Dalphon, Asbatha, Paratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Aradai, and Paisatha. Lord. Okay. The 10 sons of Haman, son of Hamadatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Verse 11. The number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king the same day. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted." "If it pleases the king," Esther answered, "give the Jews in Susa permission to carry out this day's edict, tomorrow also, and let Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles." Remember, this happened to Haman the day or so before this request. So now they're wanting the same thing to be done to his family. So the king commanded that this be done. An edict was issued in Susa, and they impaled the 10 sons of Haman. The Jews in Susa came together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they put to death in Susa 300 men, but they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the remainder of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also assembled to protect themselves and get relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 of them, but did not lay their hands on the plunder. This happened on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. This is why rural Jews living in villages, observe the 14th of the month of Adar as a day of joy and feasting, a day for giving presents to each other. Purim established, and starting in verse 20 of chapter 9. Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far. Remember, there's 127 provinces, okay? To have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, doing what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is, the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme of Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his son should be impaled on poles. Therefore these days were called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should without fail observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation by every family and in every province and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews in the 127 provinces of King Xerxes' kingdom, words of goodwill and assurance, to establish these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. All right, so I'm going to go in here. Look, it's all falling apart because I've been using it so much. And look, Bentley decided she wanted to eat my Bible. So I'm going to have to tape that up. But yeah, so I'm going to read out of here the cultural notes for chapter 9. Okay. So in chapter 9, verse 2, where it mentions those determined to destroy them. The Jews did not carry out a general annihilation of everyone who disliked them. Rather, their hostility was reserved for those who attacked them. The total number of the dead, 75,000, which is mentioned in verse 16, is extremely large. By comparison, the number of Persian males in the empire's army was reported to be 120,000. Native Persians were reported to comprise the bulk of the army. The entire population of the Persian Empire in this era has been estimated by modern scholars at 50 million people. In verse 10, where it mentions, did not lay hands on the plunder, Xerxes' edict granted the Jews the right to plunder the spoil of their enemies in chapter 8, verse 11. Okay? Completely reversing Haman's decree. The Jews' refusal to touch the plunder might be designed to demonstrate that the slaughter was not motivated by greed. But it seems more likely that the restraint reflects the fact that the conflict is presented as a showdown between Israel and Amalek. And you can look at the previous, you can go back and look at the previous videos where we covered how Mordecai was in the family line of Saul, King Saul, and Haman was in the family line of the Amalekites. So you can go back and look at the previous videos for the notes on that. Okay. And you can see it mentioning in chapter 3, verse 1. So you can go back to the video for chapter 3, and there should be notes on that. Okay. Since God had forbidden the Israelites from taking plunder from the Amalekites in 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. Let's go ahead and look that up real quick. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verse 3. Hey, Liz. It says, now go attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put them to death, the men and children and infants. Let me go ahead and click on it. Okay. So they took no spoil from their enemies in this battle either. Okay. The provinces, in verse 22, where it says days of feasting and joy and giving presents, it says, just as the book of Esther seems very secular without religious content, so too the celebration of the Jews' victory was designed as a secular celebration. There were no prayers, sacrifices, or other religious observances prescribed for the day. The Jewish tradition, the central feature of the celebration called Purim, is the reading of the scroll of Esther in the synagogue. Through the years, this reading has become a riotous affair, accompanied by noisemakers, costumes, and heavy drinking. Indeed, the rabbis commanded Jewish revelers to drink until they could no longer distinguish between blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman. In verse 23 of chapter 9, where it mentions agreed to continue the celebration, this festival... One second. Sorry, guys, had to tend to the Bentley. Okay, so she was at my door. All right, so in verse 23 of chapter 9 of Esther, where it says, agreed to continue the celebration, the festival, the festival of Purim, which is mentioned in verse 26, is the first festival adopted. I think I read that. I'm going to read it again though. Adopted by the Jews that was not I didn't. That was not commanded by the Mosaic law. The book of Esther does not demand that its readers observe Purim. Rather, it describes how the Jews establish a custom, which is mentioned in verse 28, to be followed throughout their generations. Another Jewish festival was later established in the same manner when the Jews added the celebration of Hanukkah, commemorating the Hasmoneans' victory over Antiochus Epiphanes in 164 BC. So I want to challenge you guys, look that up. Let me see. I'll type it in the chat because let's see here for that one. Okay. Hasmon Hasmon Hasmonians victory over Antiochus Sorry guys, I'm trying to write it here as a reference that you guys can do your own looking up here. Hopefully I spelled it all right. 164 BC. That has to do with another festival, Hanukkah. 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 There we go. All right. So, again, it says the book of Esther does not demand that its readers observe Purim. Rather, it describes how the Jews established the custom. And so I guess that kind of, when we talk about descriptive or prescriptive, I guess this would talk about descriptive, right? And feel free to correct me. But basically that's what that note is saying. It's a description of how the Jews adopted this specific festival and how it's to be carried out. Okay, so verse 26 of chapter 9, it says, Purim scholars, in reference to Purim, scholars have questioned whether the title Purim could actually be derived from the word pur that Haman cast. First, there is the fact that the festival is called lots rather than lot, since only one lot was cast. We see that in chapter 3, verse 7. In Hebrew, unlike English, in a singular lot is cast. The second problem is that the lot plays a minor and wholly negative part in the story of the Jews' deliverance. One theory holds that Purim was originally a Babylonian religious festival and that Mordecai and Esther are Hebraized personifications of the Babylonian gods Marduk and Ishtar. More recently, scholars have contended that Purim was derived from a Babylonian or Persian New Year festival. At such festivals, it was commonly believed that the gods cast lots to determine the fates of humanity for the coming year. But there is no evidence of pagan festival called Purim. So such reconstructions are wholly hypothetical. So, in regards to Purim, I did do some little background research, not too much. There was a few things that I found quite interesting, but I want to read the article from the Torah.com, and its writer is Dr. Amitai Baruchai Una. Okay, and I put this article in the comment section so you can read it on your own as well. So it says, why is the holiday called Purim? According to the Megillah, the holiday gets its name because the villain of the story, Haman, chose the date to attack the Jews, based on a lot in chapter 3, verse 7 and chapter 9, verse 24, which we just read, called a pur, which gives the holiday its name, mentioned in verse 26. This explanation is strange since the pur or lot seems to be a tangential, it's not genital, it's genital. It's a hard word to say, okay? Forgive me, you guys. Tangentil element in the story. The main point is that Haman appointed a day during which the Jews should be killed. Which day and how it was chosen would not seem to matter much. Why the holiday be named based on this story element. So, and it goes on to say the war in chapter 9. The book of Esther is set in the early Persian period and was likely written during the late Persian period. Although its authors seem to be quite familiar with the Achaemenid court and its customs, the book of Esther is almost certainly not a historical account of the early years of Xerxes' rule. It includes many fantastic twists and turns and other literary markers that typify historical fiction than historiography. Histography. Okay. Which I think in before when we started chapter 1, we kind of covered that as well about some of the common views of the book of Esther. So this is just another one of those views as well. Okay. The 9th chapter of the Megillah is a little different. It is not a fast-paced character-driven narrative, but a lengthy and repetitive description of a war between Jews and their enemies. This might suggest that the chapter did not originate as an organic part of the Esther and Mordecai story, but may be a hyperbolic telling of a historical pogrom against diaspora Jews in Achaemenid Persia, which the Jews won. If this is correct, this incident would be the only evidence for hostility directed against diaspora Jews in the pre-Hellenistic world, and thus might explain why an incident stood out and merited a holiday. As the battle is said to have occurred on the 13th of Adar, which extended into the 14th in the city of Shushan or Susa. The 14th and 15th of Adar are to be celebrated as a festival called Purim. But this theory is problematic, or at least incomplete, as it leaves the name of the holiday unexplained. So in this article, it does go over the scriptures. It has the, I believe it's the Hebrew and then the English next to it. And then it says the text reads smoothly without verse 7. Haman plots to destroy all the Jews in verse 6 and goes to Ashras to start the process rolling in verse 8. Moreover, the placement of verse 7 here is strange. Why Haman cast the lot before he even spoke to the king. The verse was likely been added later by an editor looking to connect the name of the holiday to the story in an integral way. The other two references to the lot, which come at the end of the story, also show signs of being redactional. In this section, Mordecai writes a letter to all the Jews of Persia, telling them to keep the 14th and 15th of Adar as a holiday celebrating their victory over their enemies, and the Jews accept Mordecai's request. The basic structure of the passage is built around the claim the Jews accepted, which appears in verse 23 and is repeated in verse 27 in a resumptive repetition. And then they highlight the two scripture verses in the article. And it says, both references to the Pur seem to have been added artificially to tie the name Purim into the story. The underlined words, which were to exterminate them in verse 24. It's mentioned in there twice. And in verse 26, therefore is underlined twice as well. These words repeat phrases from the text they are supplementing, and thus help camouflage the additions to make them feel seamless. The writer is suggesting that the name Purim for this holiday predates the explanation that Haman picked the day for the attack by Lot. A secondary explanation that developed once the Jews no longer knew why the day was called Purim. Such post facto folk explanations for names are common in the Bible. But if Purim is not really named after Haman's lots, what does the name reflect? So the article goes into the Akkadian, that the term Pur or Purim is from Akkadian and not actually a Persian term. And then it talks about how it's tied to the Mesopotamian calendars, the regnal years, Old Babylonian system for the naming years for important events. It also talks about the Assyrian systems. And then it talks about when was the Limu announced. So how early can one know the eponymic name of the year? Theoretically, the year names could have been fixed many years in advance by the Assyrian. Probably did not want to risk naming a year after someone who would by then have died. This would have been perceived ominous. On the other hand, in imperial times, they would not have waited for the year to have begun before declaring the eponym. But sometimes this early naming before Nisanu did not reach the governed provinces before the new year began. For an example, an administrative document from Tel Gezir contains the following date formula: the 17th of Samanu, the year after the year Ashur der Assur, governor of Bar Halzil. Okay, so we kind of see when it talks about dates in scripture, we can kind of see that pattern as well. So then it goes into talking about what would happen before the new year and choosing the limu by the puru, which is the ritual lot. Okay, and so it says we don't know the method of the Assyrians used for choosing the official whose name would be given to the coming year, but the little available evidence strongly suggests that the decision was reached by means of casting lots, the pur, or the puru. In royal inscription, Salamansir the third dates a campaign he launched on his 31st regnal year, which, according to other sources, was the second year of him having been the Limu. Okay. So this article is super interesting. It gives the picture of what the lot, or the lot, I guess, would have looked like. What is this? It's a clay cube. So let me go ahead and show you guys. So this is what it would have looked like. Interesting, right? Oops. So they would roll that dice, and that's how they would make certain decisions. So let's see. When we get to Purim, a remnant of the Puru celebration. So it says here, it is likely that an event as important as marking the name of the coming year's eponym through a divine lot would have been somehow marked. Although in case of the Assyrian Puru, we have no direct documentation for this. Our knowledge of the Assyrian cultic calendar is fragmentary, scattered, and by no means complete. However, the coincidence in the Jewish calendar of both the name Purim and its schedule in the middle of Adar suggests that it may be a remnant from the lost ancient Assyrian pre-New Year festival of drawing lots for the coming eponym. If so, then the celebration must have survived for centuries in former provinces of the Assyrian Empire like Babylonia, even though lots for choosing the year's limu would no longer have been cast. In light of other Assyrian features having been adopted in Babylonian Milu, such survival is only minor surprise. So, then it says an Assyrian festival becomes Jewish. The Assyrian holiday of Purim, Peru, was eventually adopted by Jews in the former Assyrian provinces and interpreted as being in commemoration of an anti-Jewish incident that the Jews survived. Or perhaps it merged with a pre-existing celebration in commemoration of such an incident. The festival was then given a literary backstory in the form of the court intrigue of Mordecai and Esther against Haman, set in Elamite Persian Susa. The backstory in turn inspired a new explanation for the holiday's inexplicable Assyrian name, Purim, the original meaning in which had long been lost. The lots were no longer celebrating the choice of eponym, but in commemorating of the lots cast by Haman to determine the date of the Jews' destruction. With that, the forgotten Assyrian festival became an entirely Jewish one. Nevertheless, its name and date preserve aspects of this forgotten Assyrian calendrical festival. If so, we are left with a strange irony. Despite the thousands of Akkadian tablets we have from the vast empire of Assyria, including the references to a Peru that was used to determine the eponym, the only text that preserves the date of this ritual and connects it with some sort of celebration is Esther, written by the tiny minority of Jews living in a province of the former empire. That would certainly be a strange twist of fate. But as we love to say about this holiday, va naha fo hu. Hopefully I said that right. I doubt it though. Purim is a time of reversed expectations. So go ahead and read that article on your own. Go ahead and do your own research on Purim. Go back into your Bibles and read in different translations. Test everything that has been said here. But let's venture on to chapter 10. And all we're going to do is we're going to read chapter 10 in the NIV. And then with knowing everything that we know about Purim now and the bullet points for chapter 9, we'll go ahead and read through the amplified version nonstop from 9 to 10. All right? Chapter 10, verse 1. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and all his acts of power and might together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted. Are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews, because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of the Jews. Now, I think what's fun about the annals, we talked about this, I think in chapter, was it 8, where the king asked one of his eunuchs to bring him the book of annals because he couldn't sleep. Let's see, I think it was chapter Mordecai honored. So it was chapter 6 that the king had asked one of his eunuchs to bring the annals to him. And the eunuch would read this book to the king, and it would get to the point where it talks about Mordecai and what Mordecai did to save the king's life against the two eunuchs that were plotting to kill the king. And so in this turn of events, right, the time reverse of expectations, right, Mordecai is now written in this book, the Book of Chronicles, once again, now 2 times, but this time not for reporting of the planned murder of the king, assassination of the king, but now that was honored, all the things that he did, and isn't that great, right? So let's go ahead and read the amplified version of both chapter 9 and 10. All right, let's bring it all together. Keep in mind everything that we have talked about and covered. Okay? Okay. Esther chapter 9, verse 1. This is how we will close out with these two chapters. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews had hoped to gain power over them and slaughter them, it happened the other way around, so that the Jews themselves gained power over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout the provinces of King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, to apprehend those who wanted to do them harm. And no one could stand before them, for the fear of them and their God had fallen on all the peoples. Even all the officials of the provinces and the chief rulers, satraps, and the governors and those who attended the king's business supported the Jews in defeating their enemies, because the fear of Mordecai and his God's power had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great and respected in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater. So the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. At the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and they killed the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' enemy. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. On that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa were reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, "The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It shall be granted to you. What is your further request? It shall also be done." Esther replied, "If it pleases the king, let it be granted to the Jews who are in Susa to act tomorrow also in accordance with the decree of today, and let the dead bodies of Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows." So the king commanded it to be done. The decree was given in Susa, and they hanged the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. The Jews who were in Susa also gathered together on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and killed 300 men in Susa. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to defeat their lives and rid themselves of their enemies, and kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th day and on the 14th of the same month, and on the 15th day they rested and made it a day of feasting and rejoicing. Therefore, the Jews of the villages who live in the rural, unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for rejoicing and feasting and sending choice portions of food to one another. Verse 20. Now Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews who lived in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews rid themselves of their enemies, and on the month which was turned for them from grief to joy and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and rejoicing, and sending choice portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews undertook what they had started to do, and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them and cast pur, that is, the lot, to find the right time to disturb and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he commanded in writing that Haman's wicked scheme, which he had devised against the Jews, was to return on his own head, and that he and his sons should endure what he planned for the Jews, and be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the name Pur, or Lot. And because of all the instructions in this letter, and what they had faced in this regard, and what had happened to them, the Jews established and made it a custom for themselves and for their descendants and for all who joined them, so that they would not fail to celebrate these 2 days as it was written, and at the appointed time. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to cease from among the Jews, nor their memory fade from their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full power and authority and to confirm. Hold on. Sorry, guys. I had to give Bentley to my mom. All right. Um, where were we? So, okay. Then chapter or verse 29. Um, then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full power and authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. He sent letters to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ashurus, in words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim to be observed at their appointed times, just as Mordecai, the Jew, and Queen Esther had established for them, and as they had established for themselves and for their descendants, with instructions regarding their times of fasting and their lamentations, expressions of needing help. The command of Esther established these customs for Purim, and it was written in the book of the royal archives. Chapter 10. Let's see. Chapter 10 of the Amplified Version says, King Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes, imposed a tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king had raised him, are not written are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many fellow people. For he worked for the good of his people, and spoke for the welfare and peace of his whole nation. I love that that's how Esther 10 ends, with verse 3. Actually, how the book of Esther ends, because it's a reminder that when you seek and fight for the wellness of the people, God honors that. So I will read it again. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and in favor with his many fellow people. For he worked for the good of his people, and spoke for the welfare and peace of his whole nation. Isn't that good? All right. So that's it for the book of Esther. I'll upload this to the YouTube space playlist for Esther. But I think the next time we've already done 2 Old Testament books, Job and Esther. And I think next we'll go ahead and do Old Testament, which was Job and Esther. And then I think we'll do 2 books in the New Testament. I think I might start with Mark. Let me know what you guys think about that. But this was cool. Thank you guys for continuing this journey on through the Bible and through the 66 books. And I hope you guys all learned something from Esther. I know I have. God bless you all.